welcome to Worlds Apart. It was once branded as a great deal, a mark of the geopolitical genius and the peacemaking acumen of Barack Obama. But 6 years later, even his own former vice president is now in a bind of whether to recommit to the Iranian nuclear deal discarded in 2018 by the Trump administration. Is the JCPOA still worth the paper it was written on? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Iran's Foreign Minister, Javad Zarif. Minister, it's great to see you in Moscow again, apparently in very good health and cheerful spirit. What brings you here?
Good to be back, and good to be back on your program. Well, Iran and Russia have strategic relations. We have bilateral areas of cooperation that we wanted to discuss, but this time I'm on a regional tour of the Caucasus, working basically on how we can turn the fight in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was ended with the plan by President Putin, which was not unsimilar to a plan that we had presented. Now it can be turned into a possibility for cooperation, linkages, connectivity in the Caucasus, benefiting everybody.
But Minister, I'm sure global issues are still very much on your mind, and every time our interview Iranian officials, including yourself, they've always stressed that regardless of who is in power in the United States, the American policy, especially vis-a-vis your country, never seems to change. And yet, just a few days ago, you penned a very interesting article for Foreign Affairs in which you wrote that the new administration can shed the failed assumptions of the past and, quote, seek to promote peace and comity in the region. That is such a huge rhetorical change. What makes you believe that?
No, actually, we've never turned the door. I mean, we never closed the door to a possibility.
But you've always been far more sharper in your descriptions of possibilities.
Yes, and we still believe that the United States policies have been disastrous for our region, not just the Trump administration policies, but the policies of the previous administrations. And I think in the article you mentioned, I mentioned some of those areas of U.S. disservice to security and comity
but you
in our
do
region.
It in very, very soft and extremely diplomatic terms, far more diplomatic than your usual style. I guess it's intentional.
Well, we want to show that the United States can change its policy. And now it's the time for the Biden administration to abandon a policy, not because of the goodness of their heart, but because of the fact that that policy has failed. President Trump started to use a maximum pressure policy with a clear intention of bringing Iran to its knees. They failed. And anybody in their right mind will try to change that failed approach, and that is what we suggested.
Now, Joe Biden's team is dominated by the old hands of the Obama administration, many of whom you know personally. Many of them were directly involved in negotiating the 2015 deal. So I guess psychologically, they would be eager to sort of reaffirm their own creation. But is it really still a good policy, both for Iran and for the region? Because, as I'm sure you would agree, the events on the ground have changed dramatically since 2015.
Well, the events on the ground have changed, and the realities of the nuclear deal haven't. It was based on changing our zero-sum approach, our mutual zero-sum approach, to something different. Now, the U.S. administration exhibited clearly that it could not live with anything other than a zero-sum approach. Whether it's possible for them to change that mentality, which is remnant of the Cold War, it's yet to be seen. We're not that optimistic, but we don't close the door. I don't think they'll find a better comprehensive deal, because had it been possible to do a comprehensive deal, we would have done it 5 years ago, before all these negative atmospherics that were caused by the Trump administration.
But you would also agree that the deal doesn't exist in a vacuum, and there is a wide belief, especially in the American analytical community, that, for example, the bloody war in Yemen, which Obama administration initially supported as a way to sort of assuage the Saudis, was the price to pay for the stillborn JCPOA. On the top of that, your Saudi neighbors have since accelerated their weapons procurements. Your Israeli neighbors seem to have become a bit more brazen in their anti-Iranian policies. Aren't you concerned that resurrection of this deal may actually galvanize anti-Iranian sentiment even further and damage your country and the region more than any potential good that it can bring?
Well, the rejection of the deal is nothing new. Israel and Saudi Arabia and the hardliners in Washington always objected to this deal, always believed that it was not a good deal. Well, they were wrong then, they are wrong now.
Well, but you yourself in many interviews insisted that Iran was essentially punished for its compliance. Don't you think that you will be punished again?
Well, this time we're going to make sure that we will not be punished.
How can you make that?
You see, the experience of the past will need to be addressed by the United States. That's a failure by the United States, and they need to address their own failure. And that is why we have said agreements are not revolving doors. You cannot enter an agreement and leave that agreement simply because of your own desires or your own wishes. There is, particularly in the JCPOA, a procedure spelled out in the deal, because this deal was made with a lot of mistrust. It wasn't based on mutual trust. It was based on mutual mistrust. So we want to make sure this time that the United States would live by the terms of the deal rather than by its own desires.
But Minister, with all due respect, what tools do you have to ensure that the United States lives by the deal? Because we know how politics is these days. They have all the tools to punish you for your compliance or for their, own imaginary mistakes. But do you have the ability to actually apply that pressure to them?
Well, actually we do. And that is also written into the deal. When the United States decided to punish us, we had 300 kilograms of enriched uranium. Today, we have 4,000 kilograms.
So your method of punishment is the size of your nuclear stockpile?
The method of punishment is the machinery that is built into the deal to ensure compliance. This deal has mechanisms to punish any side that violates the deal. Now, the United States left the deal in a much worse condition than today. When it left the deal, we were running only IR-1s with very small ability to enrich uranium. Now we are building our IR-6 machines with almost 20 times the ability of IR-1s. So they're the ones who lost at the end of the day, if they were trying to limit Iranian enrichment capability.
Now, in your article, you posit that goodwill begets goodwill, and you've known Joe Biden for many years, perhaps even decades. I've read somewhere that he has your personal cell phone number. Do you think
Actually, my personal cell phone number has changed since I left New York. So
well, maybe you can fax your new one to him again. But do you think that personal connection, I don't know how deep it is, but do you think it will facilitate any diplomatic activity between
Let me
your
make
countries?
it clear. Joe Biden and I were not buddies. We represented two different countries with different policies. He was a senator and I was a permanent representative to the United Nations. We had many civilized meetings in which we disagreed, but with civility. And I think that is the basis for understanding. But again, it's not the issue of who's in the White House. It's the issue for us is what they do. If you look at the JCPOA, it's not just the signature that counts in the JCPOA, in the nuclear deal, but in fact the impact of that signature, the effect of that signature. And we're waiting to see that. If they return to the deal with full effect, benefiting the Iranian people, knowing that their policy of maximum pressure has already failed, then we are willing to go back to the full terms of the deal.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the Iranian people, and the Biden foreign policy team has already come up with a new slogan for their vision, and they call it the foreign policy for the middle class. Both you and I studied in the United States. I think we would agree that ordinary Americans are decent, compassionate people, and surely they would not support Iranian cancer patients being left without life-saving drugs. But that was the case even under Obama. It got much, much worse in human terms under Trump. Are you really hoping that Joe Biden will be able and will be willing to humanize American foreign policy vis-a-vis your country to an extent that he could actually accomplish this lofty goal of, again, foreign policy being representative of the wishes and aspirations of ordinary Americans of the middle class?
Well, that would be a tall order. But I think they can start in the right direction. I think the policy of unilateral sanctions is basically a policy of economic warfare, or even worse, a policy of economic terrorism, because they target individuals who, with the intention of changing policy. That is, they target individuals to put pressure on individuals, for the individuals to put pressure on their government. This never works. They need to change their approach. The carrot and stick approach is used for animals, not for human beings. And I think the American middle class have to come to their senses to understand that this policy of carrot and stick does not work with human societies. It has always produced the unintended consequences, and it will continue to produce unintended consequences.
Well, I think it produced a lot of pretty bloody intended consequences as well. But speaking about how you can make it happen, both Iran and the United States indicated that you're willing to go back to the terms of the 2015 agreement, provided that certain conditions are met by the other side. And you know better than I do that there are very strong political reasons for both parties not to be seen as yielding first. Do you think there is a room for some sort of a mutual accommodation that would not make either party seem like it's losing face?
No, we have no intention of muddying U.S. face. What we say is very rational and logical. We were in the deal. We are still in the deal. The United States was the party that left the deal, imposed pressure on Iran. Now, if they come back to the deal, start implementing their obligations, then we have no reason not to go back to full implementation. We have shown time and again that we comply. Mm-hmm. The United States doesn't have a good record of compliance even during Obama, let alone Trump. So they have to prove their brotherhood first and then ask for inheritance, as the saying goes in Iran.
Proving brotherhood is a very tall order, but Minister, let's take a very, very short break.
No, that's a saying that they just have, before they ask for inheritance, they need to become a member.
Absolutely, but I mean, given the very complicated history of the United States and Iran, I'm not even sure that that particular saying applies in this particular case.
Well, the United States has violated its obligations. So it's not in the deal. It has broken Security Council resolution that it sponsored itself. It has to come back to compliance. I mean, the United States may have been used to, in dealing with other developing countries, basically, as they say it in the US, having the cake and eating it too. Doesn't work with Iran.
Well, Minister, let's take a very short break right now. We will be back in just a few moments. Stay tuned.
Join me every Thursday on The Alex Salmond Show, when I'll be speaking to guests on the world of politics, sport, business, and show business. I'll see you then.
secret prisons are not usually what comes to mind when thinking about Europe. However, even the most prosperous can be deceived.
Within the zero zone, there were 2 villa houses where allegedly this prison was located, and only CIA people had access to this territory.
Investigators share how they uncovered the darkest dealings of the secret services.
Il Parlamento non sa niente, il governo in toto non sa niente e dunque ci sono solo pochissime persone che sono informate.
Crying for justice on RT.
Welcome back to Worlds Apart with Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. Minister, earlier this month, Iran announced its intention, or actually its commitment to start enriching uranium to 20% purity, which technically speaking is a major step, as you alluded to, developing the capacity for weapons-grade enrichment. And some people in Washington interpreted that as a way of putting time pressure on the Biden administration. Now, you said there's no hurry, but there's also a domestic factor in Iran. In 5 months' time, there will be a new president in your country, perhaps even a new foreign minister, who knows. Is there any rush as far as, trying to save the remaining potential of the JCPOA?
Well, we have a legislation by our parliament, which has now become law of the land. And we in the executive branch are required by law to respect that and to abide by it. That includes enrichment to 20%, which is totally justified under JCPOA, under paragraph 36 of JCPOA, that in response to non-compliance by one party, another party can also start reducing fully or partially their obligations. So we have done that. Now, in probably February 21st, 22nd, there is another requirement that comes into play, and that is ending compliance with additional protocol. All these are voluntary measures.
Which means they end to inspections.
Limited inspections, not no inspections at all, but more limited inspections. And then there are other measures that are required in the legislation, including production of uranium metal, production of higher enriched uranium. The intentions of our parliament, the stated intention of the parliament, was to encourage other participants to come to compliance, not to play with time.
But you can do both. In fact, you're doing one through another. You're encouraging by playing with time.
Well,
what's wrong with that? I mean, they've done the same thing to you.
We are ready to continue to resist pressure, and at the same time, we are ready to continue to cooperate. Mm-hmm. Now, the option is open to the United States and to the EU. You see, the EU has been basically watching on the sidelines. They claim that they are members of JCPOA, but they have not done anything. They have not paid any price. You have to pay a price. I mean, you cannot swim without getting wet. And Europeans have tried to be a member and not to get wet. It doesn't work that way.
Technically speaking, if the 2015 agreement were to be reinstated, it would require shipping enriched uranium out of the country, most likely to Russia. Has that been part of your negotiating agenda during this visit? Have you touched on that with Minister Lavrov?
We discussed in great detail what can Iran and Russia do together in order to ensure proper implementation of the agreement, including how we can cooperate with each other and how Russia can play a major role in bringing the United States back to compliance. And the issue of exchange of enriched uranium is certainly one issue that we dealt with last time, and it can be easily revived this time.
Now, you've spoken a lot about your disdain for the Trump policies, but I think one ironic thing about the Trump administration is that it was able to free itself of any commitments, but at the same time enforce the commitments of others. And by that, I mean first and foremost Russia and China, because the sunset clause, these UN restrictions on transfer of conventional weapons to Iran expired in October last year, and yet because of Trump's executive order, because of his threats of sanctions, that ban is effectively in place.
Not really.
Not really? Would
Not
it be? Really. Are you getting anything from Beijing or Moscow?
Well, we are negotiating with Beijing and Moscow. And, you know, military contracts are not something that you publish in a newspaper. But we are in consultation with Russia and China, and Russia has announced, so as have the Chinese, that there are no legal impediments to selling weapons to Iran. And by the way, I said before the expiration of the deadline that we're not going to go on a buying spree. We have other priorities. I mean, we're dealing with COVID. We're discussing buying vaccines from Russia and China. We're dealing with other economic emergencies in Iran. So I'm not sure procuring arms would be the highest on our list of priorities.
Now, you personally like to stress that Iran doesn't succumb to any pressure, but a lot of Obama people believe that it was their program or their campaign of maximum pressure that ultimately brought Iran to the table back in 2013, leading to the agreement in 2015. Was that the case? And what was it about Obama's approach that ultimately persuaded you to start working with them? Can they do it again? Because it's the same people.
Well, if you look at the proposal that we made to the Bush administration in 2005, on March 23rd, 2005, in Paris, to the E3 which were negotiating during the Bush administration, and compare it to the JCPOA, you see that we followed the same basic principle. So we didn't change our...
So their pressure campaign pressured them into compliance?
No. You see, the fact that their pressure campaign didn't work brought Obama to send a letter to Iranian leaders through the Omanis that they were willing to accept Iranian enrichment. The reason the efforts failed was that Bolton in the Bush administration was pushing for zero enrichment, and the Europeans gave in to that. Now, in 2013, what changed was Obama accepting, in a message that he sent us through the Omanis, that he was willing to accept Iranian enrichment. So whether his economic pressure pushed him into accepting that, I do not know. But I know that the reality that pressure on Iran doesn't work brought him into the understanding that he had to change policy. I think had even Trump stayed one more term, he would have come back to the reality that maximum pressure doesn't work on Iran.
Mm-hmm. Now, one hallmark of Obama's policy was this drive to create some sort of a regional balance, at least rhetorically. I mean, everybody understood that America still prioritized Israel and Saudi Arabia, but I think there was some understanding that you need to give something to your adversary as a collateral for lasting peace. Do you think the Biden administration will share that notion that you actually have to give something to get something in return?
Well, I think for their own sake, they have to come to the realization that providing blanket blind support to anybody will not be in their interest. They have provided blind support to Israel, and you see that the menace that you have in the Palestinian area. They have provided blind support to Saudi Arabia, and you see the menace in Yemen. So any blind support by the United States, any sense of patronage to certain allies that they can do anything as a spoiled child, is bound to create more and more trouble for the United States and actually bind the United States into permanent presence in this region and permanent protection for the unruly behavior of some spoiled kids.
Speaking of peace, in 2019, Iran introduced the Hormuz Peace Initiative, also known as HOPE, which is based on principles of respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference of non-regional actors in the region's affairs. Essentially, you are asking the Americans and their Western allies not to be themselves. How realistic is that with this incoming administration, which in pretty clear terms says that it wants to reassert the American role in the world?
Well, I think the United States and the West need not be asked. They will come to that conclusion themselves, that it is not in their interest. The world has changed. We have a multitude of players. We have a transfer of the centers of power. We do not live in a Western-centered world. And they will have to come along and they have to accept that reality. Now, they see China as an emerging power that is going to surpass the United States in terms of economic power. They see the presence of Russia in resolving major conflicts. It's not the United States that resolving the conflict in Syria. It's Russia, Iran, and Turkey that are resolving the conflict in Syria. It's not the United States that resolving the problem in Karabakh. It's again Russia plus regional countries that are doing that. That realization, and also Europe. You heard what the Europeans said about Karabakh, and you heard what happened in Karabakh.
I want to ask you one more question about America's Arab allies, because I think during the years of Trump, many Persian Gulf countries believe that they can sort of redraw the political map of the region while the United States is minding its own business. But I think it is getting increasingly clear that the ability to affect things on the ground is limited, especially in places like, let's say, Libya, Qatar, and many others. Rather than calling for a lesser role on the United States, don't you think that paradoxically you and others would benefit from a bigger presence of the United States in your region, at least in terms of disciplining and being more principled with its own allies?
Well, the United States needs to be more principled with its own allies. We're not asking them to cut their relations with their allies. We're just asking them to allow the region to deal with its own problems without hope for foreign interference. I think what has prevented our neighbors in the region to come to terms with Iran is the hope that some of them were hoping to fight Iran to the last American soldier. That did not materialize during Trump. It will not materialize during any other US president. Now they're pinning their hopes on Israel. And Israel has never been a protector for anybody. They can hardly protect themselves. So I think it's time for our neighbors to come back to the neighborhood. This neighborhood, all of us in the neighborhood need security and stability in our neighborhood. Others don't necessarily need security and stability in our neighborhood. We have welcomed the Russian proposal for security arrangements in the Persian Gulf. We have made, as you said, our own HOPE initiative. So we have enough groundwork for regional security. We only need to change the mindset. You cannot purchase security from outside. The United States can sell you a lot of arms, but it cannot sell you security.
Well, Minister, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for this honor.
Good to be with you again.
And thank you for watching. Hope to see you again next week on Worlds Apart.